ancestor, there's something to be found there. And Admiral J. Loach is the subcommittee chair for the Genealogy Committee to explore and open up sea service, kind of like John Sinks has done with the tax databases.
Well, good evening, folks. This is Gary Crane, Genealogist General, and we're on our second session of 6 and explaining the application process. And I'm going to ask you to find the mute button down on the bottom side. Make sure you're muted.
What happened?
Yeah, Gary, we can't hear you.
Gary went so far as to mute himself, and now we can't hear him. There you go.
Now I'm muted. Okay, thank you. We need to make sure we have the reactions. Look for the chat button so that you can leave chat questions as we go along. And I'm going to ask Dennis Van Warmer to take charge and present the meeting. Dennis? Unmute. Dennis, unmute yourself.
I can't even follow my own instructions. So leave it muted as Gary said, and as we did last week. If you have a question, please enter it into the chat. And after the presentation, Gary will go through those and we will try to answer as many questions as we can. So let's see. Let's start off with, this is that. Okay, you should all be seeing the title slide for this week. This week's topic is proper document selection and citation. I did, since I did not have a syllabus to send out ahead of time, and there were some questions last time about topics that were not pertinent to last week's session. Yeah, what did I have there? This is the 6 sessions, and these are the 6 sessions. We did correctly filling out an application last week. We're doing proper document selection and citation this week, and you can see what the other topics are. So you may be wanting to ask a question about printing or proof arguments or research. Please hold those until appropriate week, and we will cover them. So here is the agenda for tonight. I'm going to spend some time on what's called standards of documentation. There is a method to the madness for figuring out what your information is and how to use it. And we'll talk about the SAR standard of proof. Then we'll go through the lineage area, the references section, what goes in the reference sections for each generation, talking about acceptable sources and not unacceptable, and give some example of source citations. Then I'll repeat that for the Patriot proof of service section, and we'll wind up with a couple of slides on how to purchase SAR and DAR record copies. So to get started off, I want to first discuss standards of documentation. This is your basis for determining what you have as proofs to be cited. As I mentioned last week, note that up at the top under the title on most of these slides, I will have either a citation for the application preparation manual, APM, or for the Genealogy Committee policies, GCP. Those are both the almost current dates. Those are the current dates other than the APM, which became an application preparation guide at fall leadership when it was approved by the Genealogy Committee. And I believe it was supposed to go into headquarters today and should be posted on the web very soon. And I will then be converting up to that. But up until now, I've been using this one, which was the latest one until the APG was approved at fall leadership. So let's start with standards in genealogy. One of the things I find a lot with new applicants and new registrars trying to start doing an application is they assume that any application that was approved in the past must be fine. Any piece of evidence that was approved in the past must still be acceptable. And the reality is that genealogy standards, not just for SAR, but genealogy standards in general, have been improving over decades as people discovered better ways to do research and better ways to prove their points. So one of the developments, as it says here, and as where you'll notice, I have the first two are listed as APM in the last at the end, and the third one says GCP. These are actual quotes out of that document, so you can go to that page or that section if you want to see verify that or see the other detail that's with it. But it used to be considered preponderance of evidence was enough to consider to be a standard of proof. That is no longer considered good enough for genealogical research, and we'll get into that. So now they have what they call the genealogy proof argument, and I'll get into that a little bit later, and we'll have another whole session just on proof arguments. But that is the criterion used by the Genealogy Committee in general, as well as SAR and DAR, to build a solid case, especially when you don't have direct evidence. So one issue I had with the past, or the immediate past APM, was that the term genealogical proof argument and the 5 steps that are in both the APM and the GCP actually should have been credited to what's called the Board for Certification of Genealogists. It's a national, probably even an international group that sets standards for genealogical research and evaluation. And those 5 steps in this term comes right out of the genealogy standards book from the BCG. So I know in the new APG, we've given it proper credit that that's where it came from, and we probably ought to do that in the policies as well. But in the policy, this third bullet clearly states that conclusions that you reach with your research or your proof argument must be clear and convincing or stronger, not merely probable or more likely or not, but they do not need to be beyond a reasonable doubt. And this is the actual rule. Now, let me kind of review what those terms are. I'll try to get it as close for you lawyer types, but in my words, in criminal cases, usually the plaintiff has to prove the charges it makes beyond a reasonable doubt. And I've had any number of people tell me this is like having 90 to 95% proof of whatever point they're making. It doesn't have to be 100%, but it has to be very close, so it's beyond a reasonable doubt. On the other hand, in civil cases, it is this statement up from the first bulletin, preponderance of evidence, at 50% plus 1 or 51%, however you want to say it, whichever side has more than 50% of the evidence that is accepted wins the argument, wins the civil case. At least in theory, that's my understanding. So, but where we are and where genealogy standards in general are now is in the middle. And that's where they come up with a statement of clear, convincing. And I just, again, this is my number. I just call it at 75%. It's not, it's got to be more than 50%. It does not have to be 90, 95, or 100%. It's somewhere in the middle. Let's call it 75%. So you have to have clear evidence, proof arguments, documentation that says your lineage is correct, your Patriot service is correct, and that's what is needed to have your SAR application approved. So when you talk about, when the genealogists talk about what they're looking at, there's several sets of what I call comparative pairs of terms, again, used by the Board for Certification of Genealogists. Most of these are also included in various spots in the APM and or the GCP. So the first pair is original versus derivative sources. Original source should be obvious. That's the actual source where the information comes from. Derivative sources are those that copy, transcribe, abstract, or repeat the information. One of the key points that has to be recognized that you have to double check and make sure is that errors or omissions may have occurred in the process of making the derivative copy, even in filming. So, and then you analyze the quality. And when you're looking at the quality of sources, an original is considered better than derivative sources. Microfilm copies of originals usually considered heavier than abstracts. So while there's various statements that abstracts or transcriptions can be used if you can't find the original image, then original image or original record is always the preferred proof document for you to supply. But then to be considered an adequate proof document, any published derivative source must include a citation that makes it clear where the original source record was found. So for instance, you could consider a birth certificate as the prime example of an original source. But this falls apart a little bit because SAR does not require or ask for original source documents, even if you could provide them. So, but you don't, it's in the documentation that you don't need to provide, say, a certified birth certificate. A photocopy is sufficient, and generally the genealogy staff prefer that you do photocopies as opposed to certified certificates. So to go on with the idea of the citation, the smaller print at the top, that's just a screen print that I took off of ancestry.com. That's a typical citation that you'll get when you have a transcription of whatever the page is, whether it's a census page or in this case, Social Security index. It'll give this. Now, this is great in my book because it tells you your direct source, which was ancestry.com and their index, but it gives you the original data, Social Security applications and claims 1936 to 2007. This is sufficient for a genealogist, a staff genealogist, or anybody that wants to look into this to know where to go looking if they want to see the actual information. The larger print at the bottom comes right out of a section of GCP, section 3.1, saying, you know, if the documents are downloaded from the internet, here's a good comparison. If there's a conventional citation available, such as a citation for federal census records, that's sufficient. You don't need all of this, and we'll go through what that conventional citation is in a few slides. But if you have another copy of something else where it's not an obvious one, or isn't clearly cited or documented on the actual image, this is the type of information you're expected to provide, so that, again, somebody reviewing this can know where the actual document or record came from. And this is the actual rule. It's this large one at the large print at the bottom. So that's original versus derivative sources. Now, from a source, what do you get? You get information. And that information can be considered either primary information or secondary information. Again, birth certificate's a perfect example of primary information. You get a birth certificate, it's a vital record. It usually has the full legal name of the person, date and place of birth, biological parents, and gender of the person. That is all considered primary information because that was recorded at the time or shortly thereafter, shortly after the birth, and documented through hospital government records. A death certificate can be both. It will often have birth information on it, but it's based on the recollection of who the informant was for the death certificate, which they may or may not get everything right. And if you've done many of these, you know that they can be notorious for not only dates being wrong, but parents being wrong. A lot of times they're right, but sometimes they're not. But the information regarding the death, the date of death and the location of death, which you want for your application, that would be considered primary evidence. Same thing with the marriage certificate or marriage record. The actual marriage information, both parties, date of marriage, location of marriage, that's primary. But in the marriage license portion of a certificate, it'll often have birth information, residence information, parental information. That would usually be considered secondary. One of the ones that gets a little questionable at times are family Bibles. And generally, it's kind of up to the genealogist that's reviewing it. And in that sense, it really means chapter genealogist, state genealogist, and especially the staff genealogist in Louisville. It could be primary or secondary. And here's what they offer. And including the reason why you need to include the title page of the Bible with the date of publication. So if there's information in there and there's dates and events, births, deaths, marriages, and they're, as it says, generally contemporaneous with around the publication date of the Bible, that will usually be considered primary and considered acceptable. If they're years before or even years after, that will not necessarily be considered primary or even acceptable. So family Bibles are acceptable, but it's a known fact that they're not always as reliable as town records. Let's see. And then once you have determined whether you have primary or secondary information, you then make a separate decision, regardless of which kind of information is, as whether it's direct evidence or indirect evidence. Now, this is where we get into how much more evidence you need and whether you eventually may need to get to a proof argument. So direct evidence, as it says, evidence that seems to answer a question on its own. However, it should be noted that direct evidence may be wrong. You may have something, again, a published history may have sources, maybe an acceptable document for citation, and it says John Doe is the ancestor of somebody. It's a direct statement, it's direct evidence, but it could be wrong. On the other hand, indirect evidence is something that requires more than one document to prepare a conclusion, such as you're trying to establish a link with parent to child for lineage, and you don't have anything that gives a direct evidence that this parent, this child had this parent, but maybe you have brothers and sisters and other documentation that can lead you to making a conclusion that this is a child of that parent. The key here is that if you have indirect evidence, you usually require more than one document to prepare a conclusion. Sometimes what people say, well, I've heard people say, well, you need 3 documents if it's indirect. I say it depends on how indirect the document is and how solid it is. But the key here again in evidence is judged for accuracy and reliability. This is the rule. It can be admissible, yet it may not be accepted as credible or sufficient strength. I hear this is one of the more common arguments I hear from applicants or people that have not had much experience preparing these applications. They said, well, I have the evidence. There it is right there. It's evidence, but it may not have enough credibility to be considered acceptable. So let's see. Now, a comment that I think is in one of the in the APM somewhere, it says most lineage societies, including SAR, are more generous than that in defining direct evidence. Because normally it would be, it's explicitly says on the birth certificate says so-and-so was born on this date at this location and had these parents. But there's some inferred relationships that are in the GCP there. And in another section here, 3.4001. There's 2 examples of inferred information that are considered to be acceptable as direct evidence, even though it would otherwise be considered indirect. 1850, 1860, and 1870 censuses. They were the first, starting in 1850 was the first time they started recording the names of everybody in the household. But it wasn't until 1880 that they started recording what was the relationship to the head of household, wife, child, whatever it might be. So, but they tended to put them in that order anyway. So those are allowed for SAR, for the applications from those 3 census years, 1850, 1670. If you have a census record and it fairly clearly states that so-and-so's head of household and he's some age, and the next person underneath appears to be a female name of about the same age, and then you have 1 or more children that are, 15 to 20 plus years younger, and if there's more than one, very likely in a chronological order, that will be inferred as a family union and acceptable, for instance, to prove parent to child relationship. The other one is, which I've used successfully, but you have to, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, is cemeteries, burial information. And that's on the fact that many families used a common cemetery or contiguous plots in one cemetery. So you can use that, usually not just by itself, but with other information. You can say, well, okay, this person is buried next to this person, and other records indicate they lived at the same spot, they were about the same age. We're judging them as husband and wife, or we've got children in there, so we can again do parent to child relationship. So those are two examples that are put right in 3.4001 as what would be technically indirect evidence, but SAR accepts them as an inferred relationship and will accept them as direct evidence on your application.
Dennis, you're a slide behind, it appears on visual.
No, I'm not,
Okay,
because I was just, that wasn't a
okay.
little extra point for that one. Sorry. I know it wasn't on there, but. Okay, so the next one, so we've gone through sources. Evidence. What did I forget? Sources, information, and evidence. And that leads us to the SAR standard of proof. Again, the first bullet bolded is out of the APM. The second one is a little more official, and that is out of the GCP and is the actual rule. But basically, this again, you've gone from your sources to get information to determine evidence, and that evidence must be sufficiently convincing to the NSSAR genealogy staff before the proof is accepted, and the quality of the evidence is a key element. So you have to hit that 75%. If you want to be into statistics, I'd call it 75% reliability or probability that it's correct to have it accepted as proof for your application. So if you have direct evidence, it's pretty straightforward. You got a birth certificate, or maybe a marriage certificate, death certificate, some other record that says so-and-so is the parent of so-and-so, that's direct evidence, you're all set. If you don't have direct evidence and you need several documents and an analysis of them to prove your point, that would be a genealogical proof argument, and we'll be going into that in detail in session 5. So now we'll go through, this is proof of lineage. We'll talk about sources and citation examples on the lineage portion of the application. Again, these are all quotes out of the GCP. I'm not going to read every one of them, but they'll be on the video, and you can certainly go to 5.4000, which you should have a copy of the policies and be somewhat familiar with it. But you've got your government records, and obviously right up there, vital records. It's great if you got them. The various other type, church records, other type of institutional records, contemporary with the event, can be considered acceptable sources. Newspaper accounts. Now, it does say down here, the last 3 lines, the name, location of the newspaper must be provided, preferably with a copy of a page bearing that information, in addition to a copy. Oh, okay. Oh, in addition to a copy of the page bearing the pertinent information. So those are some. Here are other ones. Family records, Bible's right up there. You may have letters. I've had a couple of applications where somebody was fortunate enough to have copies of letters from relatives. It was like they were writing it for the application, but they mentioned aunt so-and-so, uncle so-and-so, brother, sister, mother, and you could make that connection using the letter as part of your proof. It mentions the top Bibles, other books, you need a title page. Tombstone inscriptions. We'll go into this more later, but might as well bring it up now. It's tombstone inscriptions. It's not Facebook memorial pages. Only what's on the tombstone is allowed, is acceptable for your lineage, and that means you got to be able to read the tombstone. You can't have something that's unreadable and say, well, that's so-and-so's date and it says this, or tombstone and it says this, that, and the other thing. Many Facebook memorial pages have excellent pictures of tombstones, but that's all you can use on it. You can't use whatever the person put in and said, here's the lineage. Affidavits of people. This one has come up a couple of times that I know of. So applications of people with personal knowledge, that can be usable. Normally that does not include the applicant. However, there is a statement in the GCP that says if you can't get a statement from anybody else, a statement from the applicant may be acceptable, but it has to be clearly written out and basically be a sworn statement notarized to be used as proof. And there's more details in that section. Those are the general ones. I want to mention a little bit about DNA. Again, I'll get into this in more detail because of the first sentence there. DNA evidence can only be used as one element of a genealogical proof argument that includes additional conventional proof of the lineage. So we will go through this and I'll show you an example of a DNA proof argument that's acceptable to SAR. But you can't just have a DNA test or two and say that proves that so-and-so is related to so-and-so, and that's all I need. There must be conventional proof also, because when you get right down to it, none of the tests alone can prove descent from a specific individual. And we can talk about that in the proof argument a little bit. But if you have various tests, techniques, and you have that give you predictive relationships, and you have traditional evidence that backs that up, that can be put all together as a genealogical proof argument. The limitation here, for a while, you could only use it between the applicant and parent, generation 1 to 2. They will now allow also generation 2 to 3, but only one DNA proof argument per application due to the amount of time it takes for the staff genealogist to verify it. And then the last one talks about use of personal identifiable information. Basically, that means any comparative DNA samples that you use from relatives or others, they must sign a document giving their permission for it to be used on the in the application. And although I don't say it here, none of that is ever to be made public or given out as copies. And as soon as we get the APG, it clarifies it a lot more as to what you can do and what you can't do, and what'll be able to be given out as reference copies or not. So, examples of source citations. I want to make the point here that these are not actual technically official requirements. They're guidelines out of the APM. Some people use them, some people don't use them. My general statement with something like this is these have been created with the cooperation and input from the staff genealogists and are considered a combination of sufficient information so that the staff genealogists can easily identify which proof document goes with that citation, but not so long as to take up excessive amount of space in the reference section. Now, you can, as you're looking through these, fairly straightforward. I will note that this is an area I felt we talked about some of them last week, but somebody made the comment that we didn't give much evidence of the online application system being an improvement over the PDF or the Word one or the other ones. Well, here's an area in citations in the reference section where it's a major improvement, because what I hear out of a lot of people that use, say, the PDF one is, well, I'd like to put more information down there, but I only got those couple of lines and it's just not enough room to put it down. Well, in the online system, you can put down this. We don't want you putting down a half-page citation covering every little bit of detail, but you got plenty of room to put these kind of citations down. You have no problem because the online system will adjust to fit whatever you've put in as citations. The concept again being you want just enough information put in so that whether it's chapter registrar, state registrar, genealogist, or the staff genealogist in Louisville have enough information to easily, quickly match up a given piece of paper, proof document that you sent with it, with that citation. Hopefully they're in order, but not all of that doesn't always happen. But you don't want so much that it takes an excessive amount of paper and space up there. So, and again, these are all out of the APM. I think we've added a few more in the new APG. Here's examples specifically for DAR and SAR record copies. For each one, you provide the appropriate organization number and name of the Patriot. Now, check these points in red. The number is the member's number, not the DAR ancestor number, nor the SAR Patriot number. And the name is the name of the Patriot ancestor, not the member. So in both of those cases, you've got the actual member number and the Patriot who is associated with the record copy that you're using for that application. One key point is that SAR record copy is not required for in Louisville because they can have access to that stuff if they want it, but it may be required. You know, you may choose to want it. I don't know why you wouldn't, to make sure you have it as a, say, a chapter registrar, and your state registrar should want it so he can review the entire package. And the final point, which is mentioned often, the DAR record copy must be a purchased record copy from DAR, not a chapter copy or a member's personal copy. And the final point here on these, which some people have a hard time finding, just because you have a record copy does not mean it's still acceptable. It may or may not be acceptable, or it may be partially acceptable if errors have been found. That's one reason why we also suggest that when you go to DAR, and I suggest the same thing in SAR, find the newest copy that you have, especially it works especially well with the DAR, because they will make corrections in their system, but they don't, just like SAR, they don't go back and change the actual record copy or the actual application. It only shows up in their GRS system, and that's why it's best that you use the latest copy, because it'll be something that they've approved. Okay. Okay, and then this is just talking the dates. This has been something that changed here this spring for SAR. For quite some time now, DAR and CAR record copies as of 1st of January 1985, and the actual numbers are there, are considered to be acceptable, are normally acceptable. And what I mean by that is they're normally acceptable unless, note the asterisk at the bottom, relevant portions of the applications have been determined to be incorrect by the appropriate body. So just because you have a record copy doesn't mean it's completely acceptable, but for the most part, after 1st of January 1985, DAR and CAR copies are probably acceptable. The equivalent date that was decided this spring by the Genealogy Committee for SAR record copies is 1st of January 2012, SAR number 181-935 and later. Again, normally acceptable. The rest of it is essentially the same interpretation. It's probably acceptable. It's going to normally be considered acceptable, but if the SAR genealogist general or the staff has found an error, then that would take precedent. Pre-85 for DAR, CAR, pre-2012 for SAR copies may be considered as evidence, may be acceptable if they have, for those specific facts that have the verification check mark on each piece of information, subject to known errors. So just because you find one in 1984 or even 1975, it may or may not be acceptable. The point here is it doesn't have to be considered automatically acceptable by the staff genealogists. They may choose to go back and check the specific points that you want to use, or check the specific documentation that was in the original package to decide whether that piece of information is correct, even if it was verified back then. Okay, insufficient, unacceptable documentation. Big one I put in bold. Users submitted family trees or information pretty much from anywhere. Online websites, Ancestry, RootsWeb, GEDCOM, and I kind of already mentioned Find a Grave. Just because somebody put down a lineage and said this person was married to this person and they had these kids, if normally these users submitted family trees, do not have any source backing them up. If they do, go check that source out and see if that works. But just because it's in somebody's family tree, especially like Ancestry.com, if you go searching, they'll always pop up, well, and this family's family tree, it says this guy was the parent of that person. Well, that's not acceptable by itself. It may give you some clues of where you can go looking, but that is not an acceptable document. And various things, documents so illegible that the application has had to write in the pertinent information, not going to be accepted. Various unpublished things, unsourced newspapers articles are not acceptable proof. I know sometimes that's kind of talked about as yes, no, but that is the, from the standard position, from the APM, from the genealogy staff, that would be the normal position they would take. If it's not sourced, it's not acceptable. And down the bottom, various things that you can print off the DAR website or the SIR website. Just because you can print out a screen print or something, that is not going to be accepted as evidence or as proof. You'll have to have the actual record copies. Now, final couple points here on lineage. We get into there are some rules and guidelines about annotating them, underlining relevant information with a fine tip red pen. You notice that I've said, please do not use red pencil, gets dull and lines get fat. I have one chapter registrar in Michigan that I think has a lifetime supply of red pencils and is trying to use them up rather than buy a single red pen, but it's not as good. That has been removed from the new APG. It makes it clear we want only ink fine lines used. You should be marking the generation numbers at the top, and you should be putting generation numbers in the margin for the specific items. Now, one of the changes that came up a couple of years ago, and we've tried to push it, is if you have a record copy, DAR, SAR record copy, don't bother underlining it or putting any lines in the middle of that. It's already reduced 20% by the time it gets onto an 8.5 by 11 form, and it can make it just that much harder to read if it's got red lines going through it. So you can do nothing. I advise that you just go to the left-hand margin of the lineage section and put the appropriate generation numbers for your application next to the appropriate sections that you want to use there. That's all a staff genealogist needs, and they can read this stuff for themselves. And again, like I say, this will be is straightened out some and clarified quite a bit in the new APG. And then the other point, and I get a lot of pushback on this at times, but this is what we have in there, and there are reasons for doing it. So if you've got a multi generation proof and or multi-page proof, you put the generation numbers that the document pertains to at the top of the first page. And then you go on through the pages and underline and put numbers as you go through there. The other one, which I do, I get quite a variation of people liking it or not liking it. The document should be referenced in each corresponding line or reference section in the documentation proofs. So for example, if you have an applicant's birth certificate that has his parents on it, so it's got information for both generation 1 and generation 2 and provides the link, you should put that, you should cite that birth certificate in both generation 1 and generation 2. That's basically what it's saying. It helps people reviewing it that this is the link because it's mentioned in both generations. And once again, this is an improvement that you have with the online application system, because you have room to do this in that application where it has a box that can be sized for whatever information you have to put in there. You may not have that option as well in a PDF form that only has a couple of lines. And then people say, well, why would you do that? We don't do that. Well, my response to that is, think of the last time you did a application and you used a SAR or DAR record copy and it had several generations, like say the Patriot and 2 or 3 generations in front of it, and that's all you needed. What did you put down for the source citation? You put down DAR, RC, number, Patriot in all 3 or 4 generation reference sections or lines. Well, you put it in all the generations that it applies to. The rest of these are no different. As I say in the bottom, my opinion, this benefits all reviewers by making it clear which proofs prove the link between the 2 given generations by being mentioned in successive generations. Okay, on to Patriot proof of service. Same general points. Here are acceptable sources. Again, I won't go through everything. Section 4.5000. Generally, it's got to be sources created between 1775 and 1783. That's not, in a sense, it's not completely true, because there will be some a little bit later that various states have done that are considered acceptable, but they are getting muster rolls or such from that period. Official records and accounts of persons living at time of service. So those are acceptable. And publications are admissible, which quote or abstract records of these 2 types. Now, the bottom one is something that's, again, this is something that'll be in the new APG. It wasn't really in the current one. But for proof of service documents, they asked, the genealogists want you to say, if it's a DAR, SAR, CR, you put in number, and actually the Patriot is now going to be in there, and sites, and then you quote whatever the service was, pension, SW 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or Massachusetts soldiers and sailors, whatever. So you put in what was on your record copy as the proof of service, but you put this so-and-so number of sites in front of it to make it clear that that's what you're using as your actual documentation. If you don't do that, then they're looking for you to actually put in a copy of whatever that pension record was or whatever those pages were. So this is one that's, first place I ever found it was on the online application form, but it's now going to be in the APG, so that should clarify that one. Let's see. Again, examples of source citations, and this is what I was just saying too. The first 6 of them are all typical ones, possible ones that they came off somebody's application and covers is sufficient. The 6th one, if you have a pension and you just have the pension number, that's all you need. And then the example, SAR, DAR number, cites pension number, so-and-so. That would be an example of using a record copy for proof of service. Unacceptable documentation, unsupported statements in the town and county histories. There's a lot of those histories and biographies of famous people in the local area. If it just because it says so-and-so was, second in command to General George Washington, that doesn't buy anything if they haven't got anything to back it up. And there's a DAR Patriot Index, there's the SAR Patriot Research System, especially things like the Patriot biographical sketches. The Patriot biography sketches in PRS are excellent to get a better picture of the person and may be very useful in giving you clues towards that person and or their service. But unless they've actually put sources, citations in that biographical sketch, it's useless as far as actual proof. And even if they do have sources, then you really need to go find those sources and use those as your sources for the proof. But they're excellent for general information, but by themselves, they cannot be used as documentation. And again, older SAR, DAR applications in general, before that 1985 or 2012 dates, are not going to be acceptable. Now, finally, just a couple last slides on purchasing record copies. For SAR website, you go to the website, there's a genealogy pull down and it says genealogy copy services. You go to that page and you have lots of options. You can request a record copy of the application online, $10 per copy. You'll get an email link within a day or so, very often in the same day. You can also fill out the form there and mail it or fax it in. Again, it's $10 per record copy. If you want an email link back, it's $15 if you want it actually mailed or faxed back to you. Those are just the record copies themselves. If you want documentation that is accompanied a given application, it's more. You can make a request online. It's $20 minimum per request. Basically, you're saying, I want whatever documentation you can give me for so-and-so's application. Member number, name number, or member number, name, Patriot. And if it's over 10 pages, it's an additional 50 cents per page, and you'll get an email link and you print them off. You can also mail in, similarly like above, you can mail in the request. It's the same fee, $20 minimum, additional 50 cents. You need to send an email to recordcopy@sar.org for have them give you a page count prior to order. Now, a couple of points. The number there was I've been told is the number that was given out about the time the headquarters was moved to Louisville, and some of the older documentation was not transferred, or they just didn't have documentation. So the real old stuff may not be available, and vital records, and there's some various restrictions, and they're getting worse all the time. So there's a number of rules that SAR has to, laws actually, the SAR has to follow. So in general, vital records for living individuals will not be available for copying. There are also some other things, I believe, such as, again, DAR record copies. They're not going to send you a copy of the DAR record copy for that given application. If you want it, you go to DAR and buy it yourself. But you will get whatever they have, minus a few restrictions here by requesting the documentation. I think I read online that it said allow up to 2 weeks for the documentation. I don't know that that's normal because it says up to 2 weeks or up to a week for record copies. Like I say, most of mine I've gotten the same day or the next day, but it does depend on staff availability and when they have the time to go through those requests. Now, finally, DAR record copies. They have the GRS, the Genealogical Research System, on their website. It's green box at the top of the homepage. You can search by ancestor, member, descendants, and some other ways. And again, you can order directly online. They got instructions for ordering. It's $10, and you get a email link almost immediately. Supporting documentation kind of has the same restrictions and rules as SAR. That's $20. They decide what they can legally copy or not copy, and they'll send you what it is. So in their case, you may get one page or a lot of pages for that $20. The other one I skipped there. The biggest problem I have with the GRS is that you need to know the DAR member number to order if you're going specifically toward your relative's record copy. You can't just say it was Aunt Martha because they don't have an option for you to put in the member's name and get to her application for record copy. So that one's a little tougher. And in SAR with the PRS, you can know name or number or a couple other things and find what you're looking for. But that is one restriction with the DAR that I've noticed. And that's that. Wow, I made it in an hour. Let me, okay, well, I guess we're stop sharing. Gary, I will turn it over to you for questions. Unmute, Gary.
Sorry about that. I can't keep track of this machine. Most of the comments were comments, not necessarily questions. We had one, could you go back and discuss published books? That goes back a ways.
Yeah, I assume whoever asked it was a question relative to what's acceptable or not. I'm assuming is what the issue is, and that one's a hard one. We've tried. I know in the upcoming APG we tried to be a little clearer on that. There's kind of two criteria, and if Deb Maddox or Denise are on there, they can jump in on here too. The way I look at it is, the number one is it does clearly state that you're supposed to use a book that has sources cited. You're not supposed to use a book that's just one of these biographies from 1800 and it just is a rambling, even if it's a well-organized list of people. The other, before I get to counterpoint on that, the other one that I've noticed a couple times, and the genealogist will tell you that, I kind of wish sometimes they might have a book or a publication they would put out, is they do have a list of published books, records, or not records, published books that they consider to be unreliable, that they have used before and found them to be have enough errors in them that they just write them off as not being reliable. Now, the one plus to the published books goes back to this idea of contemporary. And actually we just had a application in Michigan pending because there was not agreement as to what was contemporary enough. So there was a statement in one of those that if there's something in the book and it's information that the author could reasonably have known about because he was living at the same time, or he he knew people, or could very well have known certain people at the time he lived and wrote this thing, then that can be used as acceptable documentation. I've seen that go both ways. I've seen that accepted at times, and I've seen that not accepted at times. I guess I put it in the category of if the guy says, okay, this was my great grandmother, and this is my aunt, my uncle, and my cousins, you're probably got a good chance of being acceptable. But when the guy lived from 1850 to 1930, and he's saying, well, this guy fought in the Revolutionary War and he was in this line, no, that's not going to work. I don't know if Deb or Denise on there. Bill Schwetke, I see you on there. Do you want to add anything to that?
I think you covered it very well.
Did that, and whoever had that question, does that answer get what you wanted or not? Gary, do you know who that was?
It was
Yes.
Sam Ashdown.
Yes,
Who? Sam Ashdown? Okay.
yeah, yeah, it was, thank you very much.
Okay. Gary, what you got next?
The was a comment that the Cox software will also expand, like you were talking about the online application, the comments or the reference section expands in Cox as well.
Okay, good point to make. I think I mentioned last week I've never used it, so I wasn't sure on that. But yeah, and again, it's a software. It's much easier to provide that capability in either software program.
Got a question from Bill Edelin. He says, when using a record copy of a member and they have 15 supplementals, do you use the original Patriot or the ACN and Patriot from the record copy supplemental, which is the member and the original member number and Patriot? So Bill, you're going to have to restate that, I think.
Well, I think if you're talking about you got multiple record copies, again, I would follow two rules. Number one rule is which one has the most generations that you want to use, and if you have several of them, use the newest one. Best chance that there's more chance that something might have been found wrong on an old one, and again, it's not going to be corrected on the record copy. Now, I assume Gary put words in your mouth. I assume that, if I remember correctly, as the PRC is getting more up to date and filled out, that it's going to be similar to the DRGRS, where only the known proven information is going to be in the online, and if an error is found, it'll be corrected online, even though it's not necessarily corrected on the actual application.
Yeah, the only thing that's accurate right now is well, I say that it's accurate. The closest to accuracy is the transcribing of the data from the application. The Patriot record is only guide. You cannot give that as a gospel. You're gonna have to use that as pretty much a way to get to where you want to go.
And now, as I think about it, I'll use myself in this example. My original application and my first couple of supplements were done while my wife was still living, so it had her as living. If you happen to notice on the example I used last week, I used a later supplemental after she had passed away. So I'd already submitted her death certificate. It was checkmarked on all of that. So that would be the one I would use on another application, because I've already taken care of that addition to it. So newer is probably better.
Yeah, Gary and Dennis, if I can clarify what my question was really asking, when I do an application and I'm referencing a record copy, I'll put down SAR record copy, my member number, and a hyphen, and the Patriot name. But in this particular instance, the person has 15 supplementals, and the 11th supplemental, isn't the original Patriot name.
Well, wait a minute, Bill. I had that on that slide. You put down the Patriot name of the record copy you were supplying.
Right.
So if it was the 11th one, that's the record copy you put down. You don't put down the Patriot name of his original application. You put
Okay.
down the Patriot name of the application, that the record copy of what you're actually using.
Right. That's what I was trying to clarify.
Okay,
that
sorry.
In my case, my Patriot was Everett Edlin. My supplemental was Richard Rapier. If I work on the next one and I'm referencing the record copy from Richard Rapier, I'd use my member number and then Richard Rapier is the Patriot.
You got it. You got
Okay.
it.
Just
Sorry.
wanted to be clear.
Okay, there was a comment by Ralph Nelson. He's done a pretty good job of coming up with a guide for registrars. He put it on the chat with a link to the website, so that it's kind of like a guide to showing up the first day and what do you do as a registrar type of activity. And I'll highlight that later, Ralph, when I send out a letter. John Anderson from Arlington, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I had two comments on the part about newspapers. An obit, you do take an obit, right?
Yeah, we will take an obit. We'll take anything, but the preferred document will list the newspaper, the date of publication, and the page.
Yes,
Otherwise, it's unsourced.
okay,
Now, what the genealogists say is they're happy to take the obit because usually there's extra information, or there may well be extra information in there. So yes, obits are more than acceptable, even though they may be additional proof, but
I read
they
that
should-
as just a general newspaper article, I'm sorry.
well, it could be general, but yeah, obits are specifically requested, but they should have that document, that source citation.
Okay, my second part was books. We've got cases where a book was used by the DAR and we're trying to go one more generation and use the same book. And the book was used by the DAR. Why can't we use it again?
Can't tell you. We'd have to go to the genealogist to answer that. You know, again, who knows? I mean, it could be it's too far back. I don't know what that would be. We'd have to see the actual application, actual book, and talk to the genealogist to see what the issue was.
Okay,
Harry
That's all.
Ricker.
Yeah, yes, Dennis, when you were talking about tombstone information, I always thought the principle was it had to have the day, the month, and the date. And I get very frustrated because I find tombstones with the death date and the birth date, but no day and month, and I don't use them. Is it possible to use?
Sure it is. There's nothing, that's just like any other date, birth, death, or marriage that you may put on the lineage section. They don't have to be complete. Sometimes they're only the year. Sometimes they're about. Sometimes they're before or after. So just you can use whatever date as long as it's clearly inscribed on the tombstone.
You just saved me an awful lot of grief. Thank you.
You
so
owe
much.
me.
Okay, Dave Robinson from Massachusetts.
Well, good evening, everybody. Glad to be here. I have a couple of quick comments. I noticed somebody was a BU graduate, which I was about 10, 12 years ago. But a couple of comments about obits. And in order to get the source citation correct, I would take a copy of most of the page, as long as it included the top where it might say the Daily News, September, whatever, and then cite where, as a matter of fact, at BU, we had to cite the column that the article was in. Page 36, column 12. And so I would take the almost the full page if I had to, but half the time you don't have to hold the whole page, and then take a shot of the inset of the obituary itself and submit that back to back. I don't know if that's acceptable, but that's what I would do. And you can comment in a minute. I also want to mention sources. Someone mentioned in the chat that sources are always in the appendix, which isn't necessarily true. The sources, particularly in the genealogy world, the sources are often footnotes. So you don't have to go flipping back to an appendix to get the source. And the thing about genealogists is, we like to overwhelm every document, every project with documentation. So becoming a genealogist for the SAR, you got to kind of control yourself and not put 150 documents together. It's the same, only different. It's a different world, but we don't need to overwhelm. So, and if anybody has a comment about that, I'll be happy to respond.
Okay, a couple of points back to you, Dave, on newspapers. What you do, I've done, and as far as I'm concerned, is completely acceptable. The one plug I tend to put in is somebody, for those who have it or wish to pay for it, a subscription to newspaper.coms. They not only have some good quality images many times, but I love what the way they have when you print this out, where it'll print the whole page. You can print a second version of just the article, and around the top and bottom at the top, they have their own header that says, this is from the Pittsburgh Gazette on such and such a day, page so-and-so. And I think
excellent point. And I have subscriptions to all of that stuff. The other half of my life is being a genealogist. I need all of that stuff.
And I agree with your comment too about the sources. And I know people say, well, they're maybe in the appendix. Well, I always look at the appendix, and more often than not, there are no sources. So there are some books that are sourced, but there's a whole lot that aren't.
I want to make a comment on that. There are 30,000 newspapers on file with the Library of Congress, and a very good search mechanism for that. And so if you live near it's primarily larger cities, but if you live near a larger city and you've got an obit there, most people just keep the obituary without the top of the page, and they have no idea what year it was and so on. But you can look at the Library of Congress collection is free.
Good point. Thank you, Ralph.
Gary Jensen, Oklahoma.
Thank you. Just a comment about the tombstones. I think you need to add one caveat to that. The tombstone has to be time specific, not something that has been redone 50 years ago and retranscribed. I think it has to be specific to the time frame.
Yeah, I'm trying not to get into all that stuff. We'll have another session just on research where we'll cover a lot of that stuff, but you're absolutely right. It can't be brand new. We actually had one a few years ago where we had a Patriot, and they didn't have a tombstone and didn't want to be bothered with the VA, so they had a nice new family tombstone printed on it and made up, and they printed the guy's name and Revolutionary War soldier. So there it is, proof. Yeah, it didn't fly.
Steve Gehafer, Kentucky.
Just to clarify, so I'm getting ready to turn in new applications for my brother and my nephew based on my SAR record copy. So that's not the issue with that. But like my nephew's birth certificate, you're saying list his birth certificate on his generation 1 and my brother's generation 2. And
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
That way, that shows that even though it's obvious in the case of that birth certificate, that shows clearly what provides the link between 1 and 2.
Okay. All righty. Very good. Thank you.
Okay, John Hundley, I see your hand up there waving hard.
Yeah, I'm the one that put in the comment about looking at the appendix for the annotations or footnotes. Many books put the footnotes along with the text, and that's easy. You can just copy those pages. But I had one book that I used for several Patriot ancestors that took one Patriot ancestor and his descendants. It had over 1,000 footnotes. They were all in the appendix. So I copied only those footnotes that were related to a Patriot whose text I was citing from the book.
Yeah,
and that's one trial learning. I had to go back to the Allen County Public Library to go recopy those footnotes. and it was 2 hours there and 2 hours back, so.
Yeah, I think that's the key point, thanks for making that clarification, that if they have footnotes, that makes the book acceptable, but you still got to provide them. My point was more that there's a fair number of books that don't have footnotes in the text or at the end or anywhere else. But good point.
Okay, I've got a number of comments. Is there anybody that needs to, okay, Harry, you're back up. What do you need?
Yes, Dennis, when we have more than one linking document between a generation, it pays, I assume, to prove all linking documents in the next generation coming up. Is that correct?
In general, I would say yes, but I'll even break my own rule where you'll get maybe a history book and you've got like 4 generations mentioned in those several pages, and you may underline them and annotate them, but you're really using it for, one link or something like that. So I use it with a little bit of judgment as to, do I already have 1 or 2 solid ones? I don't need to bother with another one, but I have a real pet peeve kind of with all of our application forms, in that there's nothing that helps a person understand what is the proofs that are proving the links between generations, and it's kind of left up to by guess and by gosh.
Okay, Jim Engler.
Uh-oh.
No, it's actually just kind of a procedural kind of thing. Curious, I've never done having the, for instance, the child's birth certificate on the parents' generations references. So it kind of raises a question to me. Is there a specific order we should be putting the references in there? Should that link to the next generation be at the beginning, at the end of the references? Should it be birth and death of each individual as they're called up? Marriage last? Is there basically an order to how to do it to make it easier for the genealogy staff to go through and figure out what's going on?
Well, we'll have to ask the genealogy staff, because the short answer I have for you is no. Because I have a way that I think is very logical, and I thought it was logical until we had one of our 8 p.m. subcommittee meetings, and Dave Cook popped up and said he had a way, and his way is exactly the opposite of mine. Mine is, you put let's just do generation 1 to 2. You got your stuff. Well, since you're using the applicant's birth certificate, when I get to Gen 2, I put that first, because you've already used it. It's already in the pile, and that's your link. And then I go on to the new ones for generation 2. Dave has a different way, which when you look at it, makes sense too, but he goes through and puts all the actual Gen 2 documents first, and then he puts the linking one at the end. So there is no official way, and maybe we can get input out of the genealogist. I think to me it's more the fact of just having it in both, wherever you put it. When somebody sees it again, that can give them an indication that that's your link, your linking document, I should say.
Okay, so one follow-up to that. I get the reference to SAR, record copy, national number, Patriot name. GRS is sometimes, SAR GRS committee sometimes has come up with a counterexample of, you could potentially have somebody putting in 2 supplementals for the same Patriot, but they go through 2 different links, 2 different paths, so that they are recording both of those for future use. So with the reference that you give, there could be potentially 2 or maybe even more supplementals of an individual that refer to the same Patriot. Any suggestions on how to handle that so that they're able to figure out which one it is?
My first question, are you trying to out-sync John Sinks?
No, actually, I think John's probably the one that's actually come
So
up with that. one.
my response to those kind of things is keep in mind, we're not just putting a piece of information out in space and you're going to look for it. That document's going to be in your pile of documents. So, yeah, you may be able to say there's actually 2 record copies out there with that same Patriot and that same member number, but you should only have one of them in your package of proof documents.
But didn't you say that sending up to national, there's no need to send those record copies up to them?
Well, that gives Denise and Deborah and them something to do. I can't believe that happens very often, Jim.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very.
No, I
rare
don't
case,
have
but-
an answer for that one.
Okay,
Why don't we make it the concept that you're trying to help the genealogy staff figure it out the first time. Don't get them into a trick. Okay, we've done pretty well tonight. It's an hour and 20 minutes, and I really appreciate all the attention. We had 86 folks on board to start or sometime during this. I'll try to get this recorded and out online so that the rest of the genealogy or registrars can get to it. But we look forward to Dennis repeating this next Monday, 8 o'clock. The time won't change. It's going to be 8 o'clock on Monday. And we'll look
Eastern
forward-
time.
Eastern time, yes. Okay,
Hi, Gary.
yes, sir.
It's Ron Bearden. I saw a question from one of my Alabama registrars. If I can get just a moment maybe to address his question.
Sure.
He asked if you're submitting specific documents out of a pension file, how do you list those specific documents? Like, and it could be different things all the time. You may have a court order, for instance, that you would not include in something else, or you may have one of those letters from A.D. Hiller or Winfield Scott. So my catch-all for listing pension documents is excerpts from Revolutionary War pension file, or selected documents from Revolutionary War pension file. And I think that catches all of them in that particular group of documents.
Okay. Do you put a page number with it as well? If the listing of the pension, or I know they're not numbered, but
There's usually not page numbers. Ron, I've generally had no problems with just putting the pension number down and then putting in only the documents that are needed for that thing. But I like both. Either one of yours, I think, is a more precise way of saying it. But then they're just going to be included in together, hopefully, and you got your proof of service or something on the beginning of it as to what it's for. And but I like excerpts myself. I'd never thought of that.
okay, any other last minute comments?
Yeah, Dennis, real quickly, pension records and proof of service go in the second part of the application, not necessarily in the Patriot. You don't repeat it in both places, correct?
They go in the proof of service section.
Right, they don't go in with the Patriot's biographical.
They don't go in the service description, no.
That's correct. Thank you very much.
One more and you're gonna start having to pay, Gary. Okay, are we done, Gary?
I think we're done. Thank you very much. Appreciate your work tonight, Dennis. We'll see you next week.
All right, see you guys all next week.
Thank you, Gary and Dennis.